everybody. Welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Palavito. I'll be your host for today's show. And today's show, we're going to discuss a very important topic, Social Security, and how to fix it. This is a topic that politicians avoid. They avoided it for 4 years, 8 years, 10 years, etc. And as they avoid it, this unsound system gets closer and closer to basically going broke, which now is projected in the year 2035, where the Social Security Trust Fund runs out of money. The reason they avoid it is two reasons. There is unpopular decisions that need to be made. Either A, you got to cut benefits. You can't have these huge benefits that they promise because they don't have the money for it. Or B, you need to increase revenue, increase taxes, and bring more money into the system. Both are very unpopular choices. In my opinion, you need to do both. Increase revenues and decrease expenses and make the system sound again. But right now, the politicians are ignoring it. But there's one person who doesn't ignore it. We're to bring him on, the Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States. And I'm sure he has something to say about the Social Security system. David, this one is a tough one, but it's still fixable. What are your thoughts about Social Security?
Yeah, it's actually not very tough, quite frankly. As you know, I was a trustee of Social Security and Medicare from 1990 to 1995. There are trustees, and then there are that are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate to represent the general public, and I was one of those two. Myself and my federal public trustee, Stan Ross, may God rest his soul, who was commissioner of Social Security during Carter, we blew the whistle to say in 1991 that the so-called Greenspan Commission, which ended up making proposed reforms to Social Security that were enacted in 1983, didn't solve the problem because they did not consider known demographic trends, and therefore we knew we were going to have to come back and deal with it again. Such is clearly the case, and now next time we reform Social Security, we need to make sure that we do consider known demographic trends. So we're not automatically pre-programmed to come back and have to reform it. A couple other things, and then we can get into the details. I worked with President Clinton and the White House, as well as AARP and the Concord Coalition and others, to engage in several forums in 1997, I believe it was, because President Clinton wanted to make Social Security reform one of his legacies before he left office. And we had worked out a framework for reform, which I think could have been enacted into law and is still viable to be enacted today, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But unfortunately, due to his personal indiscretions, he had to deal with impeachment hearings, and as a result, he lost all of his political capital, and therefore was not able to achieve Social Security reform. That framework is still valid. We can talk about it on this call, and let me just mention one other thing. George W. Bush, 43, the younger Bush, tried to engage in Social Security reform at the beginning of his second term. The challenge was he forgot what the second word is in Social Security. It's security, not opportunity. And he was proposing to convert it into a defined contribution type of system, which elicited significant opposition. And as a result, the popularity of his proposal was actually less after he and Vice President Cheney did a number of public events than it was before, and they abandoned their effort. So that's kind of a foundational point. We can get into what we should do here. I'm happy to do that, but it's a very solvable problem. In fact, I've said many times, we have an opportunity to exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans by reforming Social Security, because the young people don't think they're going to get it, and they're wrong. And seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of. I could use other words, but I won't. And the answer is that both of those are wrong. And therefore, we can reform it, phase it in, and exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans. I mean, I call that a win, but the reason we haven't done anything is because Washington is a lag indicator. It only makes tough choices with inspired leadership or a crisis. And in this case, they're evidently waiting for a crisis, which is just downright dumb.
Right. And with that, we have a special guest we brought in to discuss Social Security and possible solutions. We'll bring in Mark Higgins, and let's make sure we can get him to the stage. And Mark, let's listen to your opinion on the problems of Social Security and perhaps some solutions. The floor is yours, Counselor. Mark, you need to unmute.
Mute, Mark.
Muted.
My apologies.
There we go.
Thank you for the introduction. And, I agree with everything that Dave said. And, in fact, we've talked previously about this topic. And, in addition to the politicians not taking action, and it is a great point that he brings up, that if we deal with this problem now, we can, it's like a mortgage. You can spread it out over time and the solutions are affordable. But if we wait until there's a crisis, the pain that people are going to feel is much more intense. And, the other point that this comes from a book I recently published on the financial history of the United States is when you look back at the full history of this country over 200 years, we had a way of dealing with the public debt that was very different prior to World War II than it was after World War II. And really what the story is after World War II, we had most of the world's gold, which was money, essentially the monetary base back then. We had an industrial infrastructure that was not only intact, it was significantly enhanced because we were arming our allies. And we had the new world's reserve currency. And what that did is that created a false sense of confidence in terms of how we could use the public debt. And prior to World War II, we only used it in times of emergency and then paid it off. But after World War II, we just started running chronic deficits. And the American people have become so accustomed to that. And most of that comes from, most of the spending comes from entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And it's going to be one of the challenges I think we have, in addition to the political challenge, is unwinding this mentality that the debt should have been used in this way. And it's something that if you kind of work your way through history for 200 years, you see this obvious shift after World War II, but very few people are talking about that because nobody remembers what it was like before then.
We also have another special guest who inspired this program to begin with, because he has a very interesting solution to the Social Security system. And this is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. So we're going to bring in Dr. John Lockwood and get his take on how to fix Social Security.
Yes, and I guarantee you that I agree in principle, by the way, with everything that Mark Higgins has said so far. And the solution which I will present is liable to make some people's heads explode across the country, like, ah! But I'm going to present it very logically, and it will be a solution that has never really been presented before, but you will find probably that it is very much in consonance with what Mr. Higgins has presented so far. And I think that that's just awesome. So I'm going to turn back the floor to Mr. Higgins and let him fully explain his logic and proposals. And then I will present mine in counterpoint. And then after that, we can all have a food fight.
Okay, Mr. Higgins, the floor is yours.
I would probably defer to Dave on solutions. He's been more involved with that. I think where history can help add context is just giving you the framework. We think differently about the use of the public debt. And until we unwind that mentality, it's going to be hard to fix Social Security. Because I agree with what I think it was Nick's opening comment that, realistically, it's probably going to require some increases in revenue, but it also requires decreases in spending. And again, the quicker you get on this, the more you can spread it out and make it palatable to the American people. I have some other thoughts that we can get into when we get into the weeds in terms of helping with economic growth, which was actually key to reducing the debt as a percentage of GDP after World War II. But conceptually, that's, I'm not a big fan of raising revenue, but realistically, it's probably going to be required.
We're going to go across the oceans and go to a very successful hedge fund manager and private equity person, and that's Shaquille Latimer from Australia, to see if he has so many ideas how to fix Social Security.
Former hedge fund manager. Look, as I said before, I really do believe that the US would be better off in part, at least partially, privatising the social security system. I think it's wrong to expect young people to pay into something that clearly isn't working. I think that the existing obligations that the social security system has should be met. I think some level of privatising of retirement funds and putting a little bit of a tax on there, something that I ordinarily would oppose, but in this case, I would say you would allow people to have higher rates of return. A small tax that could help buffer the shortfall in Social Security would be a better way forward. I think it's in line, actually, with the values of the United States. You normally want to have things privatised in the hands of individuals as opposed to in the hands of government. So I think that that's probably the most logical way of achieving what you guys want to achieve. And I think it actually would bring you into line with many of your competitor countries.
Okay, and then we have more in reserves. We have one of the smartest people on the planet, member of the High IQ Society, Rick Rosner. The reason we brought you in is that we need a smart guy to solve a problem, which is Social Security being underfunded. Or basically,
Jacoby brought up an issue last hour, which is that people live longer now, or they did until COVID came along and dropped our life expectancy by a couple of years. When Social Security was started, in the 1930s, you retired at 65, and on average, you were dead within 2 years. Now, of course, we live to 77, 78, so people are drawing for 10 years and more. And if you look at Social Security's monthly payouts, they're based on people living to an average age of 82. So yeah, it's as people live longer, and we're gonna, average lifespan's gonna go up by 10 years in the next 25 years. So yeah, it's gonna be an issue.
yeah, and the last member of our panel coming in from Canada, who heads up our show, Modern Investment, Sasha Starr. We'll see if he has some opinions on what to do with Social Security.
I'd rather like to sit back and enjoy Jonathan's presentation.
Okay, then.
Well, there's a vote for me.
Sure.
Yay.
Well, at some point, Nick, it would be good if I told you what the American people support.
Okay, let's hear what the American people support. Then we'll hear Jonathan Lockwood idea.
Yeah. I mentioned to you before that I worked with the Clinton administration to come together with a framework for reform. But in addition to that, in 2012, I did the 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour. And we had two very special groups there, a demographically representative group of voters in a swing congressional district in a swing state in the north. Same thing with regard to a swing state in the south and a swing district in the south. And we got 77% agreement on the following framework for Social Security reform. But let's first understand a couple of things. Number one, we have two problems. We have Social Security, which we're talking about now. How do we make it solvent, sustainable, secure? All right, considering demographics and other factors. And then secondly, as Mark talked about, we have a much greater fiscal challenge. Social Security is a subset of that fiscal challenge. You have to keep in mind on any kind of reforms that we talk about on this call or anywhere else, there's one factor that people typically don't consider adequate. And that factor is political feasibility, which means you've got to get a majority of the members of the House. You have to get 60 members of the Senate and a signature of the President of the United States. And we can all come up with great ideas, but if we can't achieve those objectives, they'll never happen. Last thing before I tell you the framework is people need to understand that under current law, that if the trust fund goes to zero and the old age survivors insurance trust fund goes to zero in 2033, if you combine the old age survivor insurance with the disability insurance trust fund, they're separate trust funds, but they can lend to each other. and they've done that before. If you do that, you can last to 2035. But whether it's 2033 or 2035, if nothing is done, then retirement benefits by law will be cut immediately across the board about 21%. That is obviously unacceptable from a social standpoint. It's unacceptable from a political standpoint. It will not happen. The question is, are we going to solve the problem sooner? Or are we going to wait for another crisis like we did in 1983? Let's hope it's the first. Now, here's the framework. First, it has been said by several people, which I agree, it's going to take both revenue increases and benefit adjustments in order to come up with something that's politically feasible and broadly acceptable to the American people. The following is the framework that achieves 77% support. Number one, you raise the taxable wage base cap, roughly double it from where it is now. That's what was done in 1983 under the Reagan administration. The taxable wage base cap was roughly doubled. So that means that people who are making over $170-something thousand up to $340 would pay more in social insurance taxes, but people under that, which is a vast majority of the population, would not pay any more social insurance tax. Secondly, you don't raise the tax rate because the tax rate is very regressive. Most people pay more Social Security taxes than they do income taxes. Thirdly, you change the benefit structure. You don't make it a means-tested welfare program. You keep everybody in it, universal coverage, but you provide somewhat less of a replacement rate for upper middle income and upper income individuals and somewhat of a higher replacement rate for people near the poverty level. So in other words, we're strengthening the benefit for people near the poverty level because we still have many people relying on Social Security primarily or solely as their retirement income. But on the other hand, people that are very well off, you don't want to eliminate it altogether because that makes it a welfare program, but they don't need it as much, and so therefore adjust the benefit structure. Thirdly, you change the cost of living index to make it more reflective of cost of living for seniors. Their basket of goods is very different than the basket of goods for younger people. Fourthly, you change the investments to where you don't have to invest solely in treasury securities. You can have a more diversified portfolio of investments to generate a better rate of return. Fifthly, you adjust the normal retirement age and you gradually raise it about 2 years over the next 20 years to reflect increases in average life expectancy since the last set of reforms in 1983 and the change in the economy to be the knowledge age, where more people can, in many cases, must work longer. And lastly, but not least, you add an automatic supplemental individual savings account on top of Social Security, modeled along the federal thrift savings plan, where people don't have a private pension or defined contribution plan in order to get our savings rate up, in order to give them a better rate of return, in order to give them more control, and in order for them to have a more adequate retirement income, because Social Security defined benefit was never intended to be the sole form of retirement income, but it is a defined benefit type payment, which is indexed to inflation, which most pension plans are not, unless you work for the government, and that's a different story. Okay, but so that's a framework, and it's not perfect. I mean, there are a lot of different things that you could do, but my point, and there is a new DC component, as I mentioned, but the key is you have to do something that will solve the problem, including considering demographics, recognizing that this is a piece of the much bigger puzzle. Last thing, I've been calling for a commission for a long time to be able to deal with our fiscal challenge, but we're going to need 2 votes. One vote on Social Security standing alone, and another vote on everything else. And why do I say that? I'm coming back to political feasibility. AARP, which is the 800-pound gorilla in Washington, D.C., wants Social Security to be considered separately, and there's no reason it can't be. But we have to recognize that it's just a piece of the overall problem. And frankly, the bigger problem are things that don't relate to Social Security like healthcare and other issues.
Okay, thank you, Counselor. I think, Mark, you had a question.
Yeah, I just had a question because this is actually an interesting conversation because I was actually just talking to my cousin who just recently retired. I mean, literally this month from the GBI, Georgia Bureau of Investigation, and he is now getting ready to collect his pension. So he's in good shape and all along those lines. And I don't think he'll even be worried about Social Security until he gets to be 62 because he actually retired in his mid 50s. So he was fortunate to be able to retire. Part of that is because of health issues with I believe it was a knee replacement or something like that along those lines. But I was just wondering how many people, because I know that my cousin Jonathan is fortunate in the fact that he had already got that kind of money in set up and had already had to fiscally frugal parents that were, when they were living, taught him and his brother how to be economically viable and everything. But I'm wondering how many people are actually dependent on Social Security as their loan retirement, because I think that that's one of the problems is we got too many people that are dependent on it as their loan retirement because they don't have pensions, they don't have other means, and sometimes they are not as fortunate as cousin Jonathan, who, like I said, literally was able to retire from the government because the GBI is a government office this year and everything. So how many people, David, are retiring?
Yeah, Rick may be looking that up now because he's very good at looking this stuff.
All right, I'll do that.
I know for a fact that over half of the people on Social Security, it's their primary form of retirement, not necessarily their exclusive. That's a different question that you asked. That's all they have. But I know over half of retirees, it's their primary form of retirement income, which means at least 50%, and in some cases, much more than that. And again, it is a defined benefit, and it is indexed to inflation, right? Your friend is in the government, okay?
Right, my cousin.
And the government is the most highly unionized sector of the economy. The government is by far the highest percentage sector that has defined benefit plans. Most other sectors of the economy have moved away from defined benefit plans. The government is one of the few sectors of the economy that typically provide inflation indexing to benefits, okay? And with regard to your friend, the way that Social Security works, if he's in good health and has a decent expected life expectancy, you should wait as long as you can to claim Social Security, which is what I did, because every year you wait, you get about 8% more, and that 8% more is indexed for inflation. Rick, did you look it up, buddy?
I did, and you get a bunch of different numbers because it's all based on surveys and just what people told the surveyors. So one survey says 27% rely solely on Social Security. Another said 40% rely solely. The actual Social Security Administration says 5 to 18% are entirely reliant on Social Security. A Gallup poll said 58% say Social Security is a major source of their retirement income. So the numbers are all over the place.
Yeah, that last one is the one I'm talking about, is the primary source, 58%.
So
but you're right. But you're right. The numbers are all over the place.
58%.
But you have a situation here where you're trying to index the Social Security payments to keep up with inflation. One of the biggest issues is that wages in the US don't keep up with inflation. So whatever percentage you put on them, it's never going to be a fully funded and fiscally responsible program. And as some of the comments that are coming in now are saying, at the end of the day, we're asking another generation of people to pay into something that's already broken. So I get what you're saying, David, and I agree with you that political feasibility is really important. But I think that what we should do is to make sure that those people who have paid in get what they actually paid for. Make sure that that there's revenue there to pay them. But you've got to give people alternative options, like many other countries do. With Australia, for example, with superannuation, much of Europe does. You have to do that and then tax those investments, because you can't just force, well, you can, but I don't think it's wise to force young people who are faced with the world today, where they're coming out of high school, they're going into college at much more expensive costs than what previous generations had to incur. They're often having to get master's degrees and PhDs before they enter the workforce because it's so much more competitive. when they do go get a job, it's not paying as much proportionally as what the older generations used to get. They get two people together, try to start a family, and they're still struggling to buy a house, to even put a deposit down on a house, get a loan, all those sorts of things. And then they're told they're going to have to work harder, longer, and get less. And it does sound very, very unfair to young people. So, yes, the problem should be fixed, and young people are going to have to pay for it. But I think the young people should have more of a say here in how this is going to operate.
Just keep in mind one thing, Shaquille, and then go to Rick. A vast majority of young people don't think they're going to get anything from Social Security, and they're wrong. And so what we're doing is that we're coming up with it so that everybody gets more than they think they're going to get. And this is not an investment system. I mean, this is not a typical insurance program. It is a social insurance program. Think about the people who first got benefits on Social Security. They paid virtually nothing and got benefits for the rest of their life. So look, there are lots of different ways to go at this, but I come back to where I started. You want to make it solvent, sustainable, secure, indefinitely, including demographics. You do want.
Aren't you running the risk of flogging a dead horse here?
Excuse me.
Aren't you running the?
Excuse me. You do want to provide more options, but whatever you do has got to be politically feasible.
So let me
Aren't you running the
discuss.
risk of flogging a dead horse? Europe's tried this and they scrapped these programs for the very same reason, that you had demographic changes, you had people living a little bit older, and they weren't able to sustain the revenue that they needed. So isn't that sort of what the US is doing, is they're still trying to do something that might have worked 100 years ago but isn't working now?
All right, let me discuss a couple numbers. Social Security payouts are based on Social Security thinking you're going to live to 82. If you live to 82, it doesn't matter when you start the payouts. You get the same lump sum by the time you're dead at 82. If you think you're going to live longer than 82, then you want to wait, because then you'll beat the system and you'll get more money by getting bigger payouts per month. That's hold on. The other set of numbers is the Congress coming in on January 6th is going to be 215 Dems to 219 Republicans, because Gates resigned, and probably even fewer Republicans because a couple of them are going to be part of Trump's cabinet. So equally divided. So anything done on Social Security in the House has to be bipartisan. You're good.
Okay, let's put some gas on the fire. Jonathan Lockwood.
Oh, thank you.
You have the gas tank, so light us up with your idea.
All right. Now, the good news is that what I'm about to suggest plays off of several of the ideas mentioned by some of our fellow guests, such as Rick Rosner. Now, Rick, to his credit, mentioned the fact that originally Social Security was designed with you're eligible at age 62, but the life expectancy was below that. And then over the years, doggone it, Americans started living longer, and we started having more and more of a deficit occurring. But now, in order to make the system work, we have to take into account, as Dave mentioned, the political situation. The incoming Trump administration wants to cut spending, they want to cut the government waste, and also at the same time cut taxes. However, let's remember, if you cut taxes in any way, then that compels you, in order to address the national debt, you must cut spending by an even greater margin. Right now, the interest on the national debt is about, depending on who you ask, 900 billion, sometimes $1 trillion. Okay, that's the break-even point for Musk, Ramaswamy, and the rest of the Trump administration. If they fail to cut annual spending, and produce surpluses of at least $1 trillion per year, then they're just breaking even. They're treading water. They're not succeeding in reducing the national debt, which is what is the larger driving problem, which affects Social Security and everything else. In order to solve the problem, I will quote Albert Einstein. The late Albert Einstein said that the problems that we now face cannot be solved by the same level of thinking that created them. So you have to take an imaginative leap, and something that take an idea and take it to its logical conclusion. In this case, the idea of raising the retirement age has been floated. But the flaw in this thinking is it's been raised gradually in order to solve the current problem and make Social Security viable for the long term, and at the same time leverage that to help cut this overall spending and produce larger and larger surpluses. Is this: you take the current eligibility age, which is 67, and you raise the overall eligibility age for Social Security to age 75, and you do not phase it in. You make it instant. It instantly goes to 75 for everyone, past, present, future. Now, the advantage of this is it does not, anyone who is currently on Social Security is not thrown off of Social Security. What this does is it freezes the number of people who are currently on Social Security at present levels for a minimum period of 8 years. During that 8 years, what happens to the people who are on Social Security? They start dying. The number decreases. As the number decreases, you start generating larger and larger surpluses, which you can then direct towards paying the national debt in conjunction with the Trump administration's other efforts to reduce spending and the national debt. As a result of this little thought experiment, you will be able to sustain surpluses, multi-trillion-dollar surpluses, over a period of 8 years, which could significantly reduce the interest rate on the national debt, and it starts a reverse snowball effect. It kicks the entire debt cycle process into reverse. That is a radical idea. What it says to the younger generation to everyone else is, okay, the eligibility age is now 75. Within that framework, you have to work on savings and investment plans, which can be carried out by the states or by supplementary reforms, such as other people on this panel have mentioned. But what you need to do in order to make Social Security not only solvent for the long term, but also leverage it so that it helps pay down the national debt, is raise the eligibility age to 75. And oh, by the way, that does provide room for, such as Nick has mentioned at one point, lifting the cap on paying it. That raises taxes for a certain portion of the population, but generates more revenue. But you create an engine. You are creating a mechanism which automatically starts driving down spending on Social Security, but at the same time for a period of 8 years, and that allows the American public and the rest of the government to see what the results are and say, okay, if the results are as I predict will happen, you get larger and larger surpluses, then you're going to have a greater degree of greater portion of the American population saying, we like this, we can work with this. Social Security will still be there for the younger generations as they approach 75, and presumably as our health levels increase and so forth. But that is a radical idea. That I confess, that is a radical idea. Jumping the age, do not phase it in, make it instant, and apply it across the board. And if the Trump administration is going to expend its political capital that it has, it should expend it on doing that, and you do that in conjunction with their other efforts to reduce government waste, reduce spending, lower taxes to generate economic growth. But if you do that, remember, you must generate a much larger spending decrease. And that is how I propose to do it. Let the food fight begin.
And it starts with David Walker.
Let me start. Well, thank you, Doctor, for that idea. I will be candid to tell you, I think there is zero chance that would be adopted by the Congress.
Oh yeah. That there is that little long pole.
And that's why I come back to political feasibility, right? Secondly, let me remind you that both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris said that they were not going to touch Social Security or Medicare. That is a big mistake. Hopefully, Trump will change his mind on that. But if he does change his mind on that, it's going to have to be part of a commission process, because that's the only way you can tell the ground for a tough vote in Congress. Thirdly, DOGE has still got to be better defined. The Department of Government Efficiency, which is not a department, not in government, and not organized very efficiently. But other than that, okay.
Yeah, it's not sound like a contradiction in terms there.
Right, it does. It's kind of an oxymoron. But it's much needed. It's long overdue. It's kind of to me, it's a Grace Commission on steroids. And it appears that it's going to focus on the organization and operations of government, not tax policy, not, Social Security, not Medicare, not, priorities with regard to overall spending or policy issues. And so ultimately what's going to have to happen is DOGE is going to have to do its thing. If it goes about it the right way, I think it can save several $100 billion a year. There's no way it's going to save $2 trillion a year. Okay. But it could save several $100 billion a year. But then how are we going to get with the rest? That's why we're going to have to take on Social Security. We're going to have to take on Medicare and Medicaid, and we're going to have to reprioritize and reduce discretionary spending in other areas of government, including defense. There's a lot of waste in defense, and we're going to have to generate more revenues as a percentage of GDP. And that's through comprehensive tax reform that makes it simpler, fairer, more maintains competitiveness, but also makes it more enforceable, because right now it's way overly complex. Not enough people are paying something, and the wealthy aren't paying as much as they should. So, one of the things we really got to deal with on this is it's not just what needs to be done, but how do we get it done? It's the old thing. I used to be with Price Waterhouse, and they had now they're Guidehouse, the part I was with. And they used to have a good saying. The strategy was strategy to execution. We need to have a strategy, but we need to also have a way to figure out how we're going to execute the strategy. And that's why it's not just what needs to be done, but how do we get it done in order to make it politically feasible.
Yes, Shaquille.
I just wanted quickly, without changing the topic too much, I just want to touch on something that David mentioned there, and just I think that we're all concerned about. If the Social Security trust funds are, at risk of running out of money, as I understand, the Medicare trust funds are at risk as well. And if I understand your system correctly, Medicare mostly kicks in for the older generation. Younger people tend to have private health insurance if they can afford it. Is there a similar sort of proposal that you would suggest with Medicare in order to make sure that it is funded and functional for people that need it?
Yeah, we probably want to have a separate discussion about Medicare and healthcare, because it's a much bigger challenge. But the bottom line is Medicare has a similar Medicare Part A. There's actually several programs for Medicare. Medicare Part A, which is for hospital insurance. And it is for people 65 and over. So it's only for people 65 and over. Medicaid is for the poor. But it is projected to run out of money within the next 10 years or so. And the gap is about 10 to 15%. They have a 10 to 15% gap. So what do you do with that? Do you cut physician payments? Do you cut what's covered? Do you raise revenues? Or you do some combination thereof. I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind in the United States, and I'll just leave it at this for right now, because Social Security is enough to digest, I think, today, is we're the only country on earth that I know of that writes a blank check for healthcare. We don't have a cap on how much we're willing to pay for healthcare. And even countries like Sweden that have socialized insurance cradle to grave have a cap on what they're willing to pay. We're writing a blank check. That's got to change. And a number of other things have to change with regard to the overall healthcare system, including, while we're trying to control healthcare costs, we subsidize healthcare costs to the tune of several $100 billion a year through the tax code. Individuals do not pay income tax or payroll tax on provided and paid healthcare, which disassociates them from the true cost of healthcare and exacerbates our problem. Kim?
Yeah, so taking a look at the fact that people make 8% a year on their Social Security while they let it accrue, perhaps reducing that interest rate a little bit, and giving the younger people an opportunity to continue paying in. Don't tell them that they have to wait longer to get it, because, a lot of people don't live that long. Although life expectancy has grown, But when I take a look at some of these things, why not inspire the youth? Yeah, I've read something that was posted, but give them something to and worth investing in. So, like, I have decided not to pay my insurance and my taxes through escrow anymore. I want to make interest on that myself. So I put money aside to pay that later and earn my interest on that. Teach the children to invest their money and give them high reward for doing so, like if they're investing in their future. But when I take a look at, if they're giving 8% back to people waiting, why not reduce that just a little bit and spread that out amongst the people? 8% is a lot. It's higher than the average, most people make on their investments. And I think that would be one place. And get the sticky fingers out of it. Use AI, use blockchain. People pay in and the system pays out. But get the sticky fingers out of it. And I read that one too. So.
Several key points. First, anybody can retire as early as 62, and nobody is talking about changing that. The only thing that people are talking about is whether or not you change the normal retirement age, which right now is 67, as to whether or not that should go up anymore. Secondly, the 8% is basically an actuarial adjustment. As Rick mentioned before, the benefit structure is such that they assume that you're going to live to a certain age. And if you don't end up taking your benefits as early, then by delaying taking your benefits, then you get 8% more per year because they're paying you out for fewer years based upon so it's not it's basically, how much more you get for this, assuming that you're going to live to a certain year where everything comes out equal. And then last, and we've talked about this before, we desperately need to require a financial literacy course before people graduate from high school. Okay.
Yes.
It's one of the reasons that we have a lot of problems that we have, including too many people relying upon Social Security as their sole or primary source of retirement income. Never intended to be, not adequate. And so something's got to change.
Well, and I agree with you on that. We also have too many of the youth graduating in such high debt that they don't want to continue working here in the United States anymore because it's not to their benefit. So, I mean, this whole country is in a mess because anyone in office didn't have financial literacy background. And that's an apparent, statement right there. I mean, that is true. That is so true because no one should have been making the mistakes that have happened. But I would slightly disagree with you on the 8%. I think if we reduce that and spread it out and let the money accrue back into the trust to grow, I think that it would be better all the way around rather than changing the age and adjusting other things or just deleting it completely. If it's earning 8%, I would hope that it's earning more. I was taking a look at the numbers of the 1 year in 2016. It received $958 billion in income and spent $922 billion. I'm sure it's far worse now, although they did claim over 825,000 people who were getting it during COVID died. So that was 825,000 people it reduced. COVID reduced.
You go to Mark, one quick comment, and that is, by law, rightly or wrongly, any surplus in the Social Security and Medicare system has to be invested in U.S. Treasury securities or other debt that is guaranteed by the full faith and credit of the United States government. Needless to say, U.S. Treasury securities don't earn anywhere near 8%, although the rate is up significantly over several years ago. Mark, you had your hand up?
Yeah, it just strikes me, taking a step back, the reason I liked Dave's proposal is because at the end of the day, we have a collective problem that you're going to have to cause pain somewhere to solve. And the more you spread it out and affect everybody, whether it's increasing revenue whether it's increasing the retirement age, that if anything can make it politically feasible, it is that. I've heard some blunt force type things, raising the retirement age to 75%. That's just not realistic. Shaquille, it seems like you're a little more focused on investing our way out of it, which can help, but that's not addressing the whole problem. And the other point is just there needs to be, I don't know how you do this. It's a tough problem, but there needs to be a mentality shift in this country of dealing with problems collectively and accepting that you may get hurt a little. Every time there's a solution put forward, it's like the immediate inclination is how's it going to hurt me? And I get that. That's a natural human reaction, but that it seems, looking as a historian, it seems that individualistic mentality has gotten much more intense after over the last 80 years. And it's hard to see this getting addressed successfully until people start thinking collectively and accepting that they're gonna lose a little. And the more you spread that out broadly, which I think, without knowing the details of Dave's proposal, it seems generally it's hitting that mark, the more likely it'll be politically feasible and acceptable to the American people, is my thought.
Mark, the key in my opinion, that will go to Rick, is citizen education and engagement is absolutely critical. All right. You have to help them understand what happens if we do nothing. And if we do nothing, everybody gets a 21% benefit cut immediately and growing over time. So you ground that. So therefore, doing nothing is not an option. And then you have to talk about, well, what are some of the things that we should do? And you have to do it as a package. And one of the frustrations that I have is, let me give you a typical kind of polling that is done on this, okay? Do you want to have to work longer to get Social Security? Would you like to pay higher taxes for Social Security?
Yeah.
Would you like to get a lower benefit for? I mean, that's the kind of polling that's done on this.
Yeah, of course, right? They're going to say, yeah.
where they haven't built the burning platform that doing nothing is not an option. Here's what you get if you do nothing. That's not acceptable. All right, let's talk about some things we have to do. Let's spread it around. And as I said, when you do that, you can come up with a system that everybody gets more than they think they're going to get. Not more than they've been promised, but more than they think they're going to get, which makes it politically feasible. And that's the approach we need to take. And whether it be for Social Security reform or comprehensive fiscal reform, citizen education engagement and some type of a formal mechanism, commission mechanism, is the way forward to get people to make decisions before we have an actual crisis that will force them to make a decision.
So I agree with Mark that we've gotten more selfish in the past 80 years since World War II. World War II, you got drafted, you had a 10% chance of getting killed when you were shipped off to war. Today's Americans would not put up with that. Back in the 30s, people didn't have crap, and they kind of teamed up. America bonded together to fight the Nazis, and things are different. Social reality TV, social media makes us feel more exalted, more deserving, and less willing to make sacrifices.
The one thing I agree with you to some extent. I will disagree that Americans have a habit, when push comes to shove, they rise up. And the day before Pearl Harbor, 2/3 of the United States was against getting involved in World War II. The day after Pearl Harbor, not everybody, the vast majority were motivated to defeat the new enemy, the Empire of Japan. So I personally think it's latent and dormant, and it will come out. And it tends to come out in crises, which I would hope to avoid, but I don't think it's dead.
Yeah, Sasha.
This conversation strikes me as a quite unusual in terms that just a couple of weeks ago, Donald Trump was elected a new 47th president of the United States. he won a majority vote as well. He won the Senate, he won the House, he has the judiciary. I mean, so there is a new era in American politics, nothing to do with the previous 4 years or even 40 years, if you wish. It's something completely new. So with the talent available to him, such as J.D. Vance and Ramaswamy, and of course the great Elon Musk,
Yeah.
do you think he needs anybody's advice what to do with this or that? Aren't we wasting our time?
No, first you have to understand that he won the Electoral College. He won the popular vote. He did not win a majority of the American people, but he won the popular vote, which hasn't happened for a Republican in 20 years. He won a clear victory. The Senate is now Republican. The House is still Republican, but very, very close margins. All right. Here's the key. You can have all kinds of super bright people and you can have all kinds of good ideas. But if you don't engage the American people in ways that will enable the Congress, which is a lag indicator and is primarily concerned with keeping their job, if you don't engage the American people in the right way to be able to till the ground, set the table for a vote that otherwise they would never vote on, you won't be successful. It's as simple as that.
Well,
Mark,
let it be that way. Well, let the things fall where they do, and I don't think that he needs anybody's help in that department at all. That's my opinion.
Well, where he needs help is he needs help engaging the American people, right? I mean, that's where he needs help. I mean, as I said, there are ideas like Social Security, which is what this program's about. There have been ideas about how to reform Social Security that have been broadly acceptable for, 25 years. All right. But nothing's been done. And nothing's been done in part because we haven't had a president exerting leadership on it, including the current president, including the president-elect. He said he doesn't want to touch it. Right. So hopefully he'll change his mind on that. But in order to be able to get it done, you may or may not be familiar, Sasha, with something called Simpson-Bowles. That was a commission that was done back in 2010 to try to do comprehensive fiscal reform, but President Obama abandoned it. But beyond President Obama abandoning it, and the fact that it wasn't statutory, didn't have a guaranteed vote for its recommendations, they did zero citizen education and engagement. They did zero of engaging the people. We need to make these changes. What do you think? Here are some ideas. And that's a fatal flaw because the people are way ahead of the politicians. They know you can't continue to do what we're doing. And they're willing to accept tough choices if they're part of a comprehensive goal-based plan consistent with principles and values that bring people together rather than divide them apart. 92% would agree with that.
Mark, you're muted.
Muted, Mark.
You're muted.
Myself and everything. Hold on, just really quickly, and I wanted to hear Mark Higgins' idea around this because Rick kind of alluded to it and everything. I would say it's been ever since the Reagan era, and I do remember a very popular movie called Wall Street and everything, that there was this notion of a greed mentality in the United States, and that might be part of the problem with our fiscal responsibility and our thoughts around fiscal responsibility. So do you think of a way outside of maybe controlling some of the media outlets that we can get rid of this greed mentality, which I think is part of the problem even with Social Security? But I just wanted your take on this, Mark Higgins, because you kind of alluded to it, but I just wanted your take as a historian, because that's been
it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to solve because usually a crisis is what solves it, and you don't want that. I wouldn't say you'd be surprised. The greed mentality is not unique to the 1980s. I mean, that was specifically focused on the emergence of private equity, essentially. Right. That's what Wall Street was based on. And there were reasons why private equity took off in the 1980s. Interest rates were going down, valuations were going up. There's a lot of inefficiency from the Great Inflation in the 1970s. But, things are more static in the United States mentality wise. We are a nation that really hasn't, in my opinion, hasn't changed much in terms of we are a place where you come or you're born into where there is very real opportunity if you put in the work, you educate yourself. There is more opportunity. I don't know if it's more than anywhere in the world, but it's definitely, you know, in the top tier. And I don't think that has changed much. We go through ebbs and flows of when opportunities are particularly robust. The pendulum swings on you know on political history, but at the end of the day, that drive and the opportunity in the United States, the desire to make things better, the desire to fix things, the desire to make the world a better place. We don't always succeed, but there's something about the United States. I haven't seen that disappear, and it may seem dormant now. I don't think it has disappeared. I think it's still present. I don't know.
I'm interested in seeing what Mark thinks about this, but it's hard to fight greed when we have so much great stuff. In the 1930s, even if you were rich, you only could buy stuff made in the 1930s, which was mostly crappy. Now we've got, with all the technology and our devices, we have, you know, we live like kings compared to people of the World War II era.
You know, that's something that Charlie Munger would drill in on. He lived through the Great Depression, and he would just be mystified by, you know, that was real time of desperation. Now, you get into the details of it. It was a lot of policy mistakes, but it's a good point. We've become so accustomed to having a lot relative to history, but you don't compare yourself to history. You compare yourself to your neighbor. There's a great quote that I often use from J. Pierpont Morgan, the founder of, you know, they went by Pierpont, but, you know, he's J.P. Morgan. And he said, nothing so undermines your financial judgment as the sight of your neighbor getting rich. And it is a truth that is just as true today, if not more so today, because of social media, as it was in the late 1800s.
I think
Go ahead.
And oftentimes they're not rich; they're just heavily in debt because they've borrowed the money for the new car and the shiny house and the you know, expensive holiday that they're going on.
Kim, go ahead, and then I'll wrap up.
So I was just going to make a point that when my husband and I were younger, our financial advisor told us not to rely on pensions, Social Security, or anything to retire with, to rely on ourselves. We weren't given any hoorahs or inspiration to do this. We did it on our own. We took a lot of money every week from our paycheck, and we just invested it. To our misfortune, the pensions were cut. And, you know, as I notice now, Social Security is as well. But we took our money. There are great formulas out there to start teaching your children. I've established a little book and a savings box for children so they can learn how to do this. The formulas work out that if you start out at 18, putting aside $100 a paycheck, that by the time you're 40, you'll have $2 million. But that's, of course, not just with setting aside that money, but with investments as you grow. So I'm trying to teach the children in my life how to do that with a little book that I've made for them, how much money they put aside, how to keep track of it. But I think financial literacy is going to be very important and very necessary if anyone is going to survive the future in America.
Last thing, I think too many Americans are spoiled.
I agree.
I think we have a malady that has reached epidemic proportions, especially in Congress, and that is myopia, short-sightedness. People are concerned about today rather than taking steps to help create a better tomorrow. Secondly, tunnel vision. They look at one issue at a time without understanding the big picture, the domino effect, the interrelationship of different issues. And then thirdly, self-interest. What's in it for me? Okay. Those three things, I think, have reached epidemic proportions, and we've got to combat that. That's a cultural challenge, and let's take it on because that's what's going to be necessary to win.
And then we'd like to thank Honorable David M. Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, special guest Mark Higgins, and of course our panelists from around the world. And we'll see you next week on Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. Until then, stay safe.